April 14th, 1865, Washington, D.C. 5 days after the cannons fell silent, a new kind of silence, a deadly calm, settled over a 26-year-old man. In his hand, a single-shot .44 caliber Derringer. In his mind, a twisted conviction. He was not a killer. He was Brutus. Tonight at Ford's Theater, he would save the Republic from a tyrant. The nation, weary from 4 years of unimaginable carnage, believed victory had arrived. But for John Wilkes Booth, the celebrated actor, the true war had only just begun. From the shadows of a divided country, a meticulous plan was about to unfold, one that would redefine sacrifice and treason, and forever etch its stain upon the fabric of America. Before we delve into the untold narrative of that fateful night, tell us in the comments, from what part of the world are you joining the Hidden Files investigation today? Now let us rewind to the spring of 1865 and witness the final chilling act of a ghost patriot. The spring of 1865 draped Washington, D.C. in a complex, almost contradictory atmosphere. Just 5 days prior, on April 9th, General Robert E. Lee had surrendered his forces to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, effectively signaling the end of 4 devastating years of civil war. The capital, long a hub of wartime urgency, now exhaled a collective weary sigh of relief. Joyous celebrations had spontaneously erupted in the streets, church bells pealed, and the city resonated with the hard-won victory of the Union, a triumph purchased at the staggering cost of over 620 American lives. Yet, beneath the veneer of festivity, a profound national exhaustion lingered, a deep trauma that underscored the immense task of reunification and healing still to come. At the heart of this duality stood Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States. His gaunt frame bore the visible toll of the conflict, his face etched with the unyielding strain of leadership through the nation's bloodiest trial. Nevertheless, in the wake of Lee's surrender, a palpable sense of relief softened his characteristically melancholic eyes. The immense burden of war, for a moment, seemed to lessen. Seeking a brief return to normalcy, a fleeting escape from his presidential duties, Lincoln decided on the morning of April 14th to attend a performance of Our American Cousin, a popular British comedy, at Ford's Theater on 10th Street. His wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, who had endured her own share of personal sorrow and public criticism, would accompany him. Their presidential box, adorned with American flags and a portrait of George Washington, awaited them, a public gesture of a nation beginning to find peace. Across town, in the deepening shadows near the theater's stables, another man meticulously prepared for a far darker personal drama. John Wilkes Booth, a celebrated Shakespearean actor just 26 years old, was a figure of striking contradictions. Possessing remarkable physical beauty, a powerful voice, and a magnetic stage presence, he commanded an impressive $20,000 annually, making him a theatrical star of his era. He was part of the renowned Booth acting dynasty, son of the celebrated British tragedian Junius Brutus Booth and younger brother to Edwin Booth, considered the greatest Shakespearean actor of his generation. Yet, beneath this public persona of a gifted artist, a psyche consumed by fervent political extremism festered. As he methodically checked his single-shot .44 caliber Derringer pistol and a 7-inch Bowie hunting knife, Booth did not view himself as a criminal. In his inflamed imagination, he was destined to be a new Brutus, a classical avenger tasked with saving the Republic from a tyrant. He believed Lincoln had destroyed the South and trampled the Constitution, and it was his sacred duty to intervene. Booth's visceral identification with the Confederate cause was deeply rooted in his personal history and the complex political landscape of his home state. Born in 1838 in Harford County, Maryland, he grew up in a slaveholding state that, despite its Southern sympathies, had been forcibly retained within the Union. This retention, secured in part by Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus and the arrest of pro-Confederate legislators in 1861, fueled Booth's profound resentment. He saw these actions not as necessary wartime measures, but as tyrannical abuses of power, direct assaults on individual liberty and state sovereignty. For Booth, living in a Southern sympathizing state under Union occupation, Lincoln embodied a despot akin to King George III, suppressing the very self-determination the American Revolution had championed. He believed the Southern states were merely exercising their rightful claim to independence, making Lincoln, in his eyes, the oppressor. This warped perspective was widely echoed within elements of Southern society and among its Northern sympathizers. The Confederacy, established in 1861, framed its secession and defense of slavery within the rhetoric of constitutional principles and states' rights. Confederate President Jefferson Davis presented the conflict as a struggle for freedom against federal overreach. This narrative resonated profoundly with men like Booth, who had been raised in a culture that romanticized Southern chivalry, plantation honor, and a rigid social hierarchy underpinned by slavery. For these individuals, Lincoln represented not emancipation or the preservation of the Union, but the violent destruction of a cherished way of life, an invasion of sovereign territory, and the imposition of a radical social revolution through federal power. The prospect of black emancipation, and even more so, black suffrage, was anathema to Booth, a direct threat to what he considered a divinely ordained racial order. He genuinely believed that by eliminating Lincoln, he would be defending his country and restoring its true constitutional foundations. Booth's intense political convictions began to manifest in concrete actions in 1864, as the Confederacy faced imminent collapse under the relentless pressure of Union forces. Initially, his plan was not assassination, but a desperate scheme to kidnap Lincoln. His objective was to seize the president and exchange him for Confederate prisoners of war, hoping this audacious act might still alter the course of a war clearly turning against the South. To execute this plan, he assembled a small, disparate group of conspirators in Washington. George Atzerodt, a German-born boat builder, was an unreliable and often intoxicated participant, lacking Booth's fanaticism. David Harold, a young pharmacist's assistant, was a naive, loyal follower, more adventurer than ideologue, useful for his knowledge of local terrain. Lewis Powell, a towering and powerfully built former Confederate soldier, was perhaps the most dangerous and committed of the group, capable of extreme violence and unwavering in his loyalty to Booth's cause. For months, Booth meticulously planned the abduction, observing Lincoln's movements and devising escape routes through Washington and across the Potomac River into Confederate sympathizing Maryland. Despite several aborted attempts, including a foiled ambush of Lincoln's carriage near the soldier's home, the president's unpredictable schedule and last-minute changes to his plans consistently frustrated Booth's efforts. On more than one occasion, the conspirators assembled, armed and ready, only for Lincoln to change his route or cancel his appearance at the last moment. While security was lax by modern standards, it proved just sufficient enough to inadvertently thwart Booth's increasingly desperate attempts. As the war rapidly drew to a close with Grant's relentless campaigns and Sherman's devastating march to the sea, the rationale for a prisoner exchange dwindled. The Confederacy was crumbling, rendering Booth's grand kidnapping scheme increasingly irrelevant. Yet, Booth's obsessive fervor, far from diminishing, was only intensifying, poised to transform into a far more lethal and desperate act. The spring of 1865 had brought a fragile hope to the nation, but for John Wilkes Booth, it brought a stark realization: his initial plan was obsolete. The rapid succession of Union victories in early April obliterated any pretense of a Confederate bargaining chip. On April 2nd, Richmond, the Confederate capital, fell to Union forces. 1 week later, on April 9th, General Robert E. Lee formally surrendered his Army of Northern Virginia to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. These events extinguished the last flickering embers of the Confederacy's military might. With the war effectively over, the strategic value of kidnapping President Lincoln for a prisoner exchange vanished entirely. The purpose in Booth's twisted logic was gone. His desperate scheme, months in the making, now lay in ruins. Yet, his profound hatred for Lincoln remained, festering and intensifying. The objective merely shifted, morphing from abduction to assassination. The catalyst for this pivotal and deadly transformation occurred just 2 days after Lee's surrender, on April 11, 1865. President Lincoln delivered a speech from a second-story window of the White House to a jubilant crowd celebrating the Union victory. In his address, Lincoln outlined his vision for Reconstruction, a path forward for healing the fractured nation. Critically, he suggested that African American men who had served honorably in the Union Army, a force numbering approximately 180 Deuauzers, should be granted the right to vote. Booth, along with his conspirator Lewis Powell, was present in the audience that day, standing close enough to hear the president's words distinctly. For Booth, Lincoln's proposal was not an act of justice or reconciliation, but an unforgivable offense, the ultimate betrayal of his perceived Southern way of life. The idea of black men, so recently enslaved, being elevated to the status of citizens with suffrage, ignited a furious, visceral response within him. Turning to Powell, Booth reportedly hissed, "That means nigger citizenship. Now by God I'll put him through." In that precise moment, any remaining ambiguity in Booth's mind dissolved. The tyrant had not merely crushed the South militarily, he was now intent on dismantling its entire social and racial structure. The time for political maneuvering was past. The time for a Brutus had arrived. The next 3 days were a whirlwind of intensified planning and resolute action for Booth. By the morning of April 14th, he learned of Lincoln's intention to attend Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater that evening. This confirmation galvanized him. Ford's Theater was not merely a venue, it was Booth's domain. He had performed there countless times, knew its every secret passage, every creaking floorboard, every exit route. He understood its rhythms, its staff, its vulnerabilities. He was intimately familiar with the layout of the presidential box, Box 7, on the dress circle level, and the narrow corridor leading to it. This intimate knowledge, honed over years of theatrical performance, would prove crucial to his deadly design. Throughout that fateful Friday, Booth engaged in a series of methodical preparations. He meticulously prepared his weapons, the small but powerful Derringer pistol, capable of inflicting a fatal wound at close range, and his 7-inch Bowie knife, a formidable bladed weapon designed for combat. He ensured his escape route was clear and ready. His swift bay horse, known for its speed and endurance, was saddled and positioned in the rear stables behind the theater, primed for a rapid departure. He even drilled a small hole in the door to the presidential box, creating a peephole that would allow him to observe Lincoln's movements and time his entry perfectly. This was not the work of a madman in a frenzied rage, but a chillingly calculated act, executed by a man utterly convinced of the righteousness of his cause. The conspiracy, initially conceived for kidnapping, was now rapidly expanded into a coordinated, multi-target assassination plot designed to decapitate the entire Union government. Booth would personally handle Lincoln. Lewis Powell, the physically imposing former Confederate soldier, was tasked with a simultaneous attack on Secretary of State William Seward at his Lafayette Square home. Seward, convalescing from a carriage accident, was known to be vulnerable. George Atzerodt, the hesitant boat builder, was assigned to assassinate Vice President Andrew Johnson at Kirkwood House, his temporary residence. The intent was to plunge the federal government into chaos, to avenge the South and, in Booth's deluded mind, to inspire a new Confederate uprising. The conspirators were instructed to strike at precisely 10:15 p.m., ensuring maximum disruption and increasing the chances of success for each assailant. As the day progressed, a subtle tension permeated the air, unnoticed by the general public, but keenly felt by Booth and his co-conspirators. Washington, D.C. Buzzed with the usual Friday evening activity, a city preparing for a night of entertainment and social gatherings, blissfully unaware of the meticulously planned violence about to unfold. At approximately 8:25 p.m., President Lincoln, accompanied by Mary Todd Lincoln, Major Henry Rathbone, and his fiancée Clara Harris, arrived at Ford's Theater. Their arrival was met with a spontaneous cheer from the audience, prompting the orchestra to pause its performance and strike up, "Hail to the Chief." Lincoln acknowledged the crowd with a weary smile, then proceeded to the presidential box. A critical security failure facilitated Booth's impending act. The Metropolitan Police Department of Washington had assigned Officer John Parker as Lincoln's personal bodyguard for the evening. Parker, however, was known for his lax discipline. After ensuring the presidential party was seated, he left his post outside the box, likely seeking a better view of the play from a seat in the audience or, as some accounts suggest, stepping out for a drink at a nearby tavern. This decision left the entrance to the presidential box unguarded, a fatal lapse that would irrevocably alter the course of American history. As the play, Our American Cousin, progressed, Booth watched from the shadows, his heart pounding with a mix of adrenaline and resolute purpose. He entered Ford's Theater unhindered, his fame as a beloved actor granting him free passage through the usually restricted backstage areas and upper levels. He moved with a practiced grace honed by years on stage, ascending the stairs to the dress circle. His gaze, piercing and focused, remained fixed on the door to Box 7. Approaching his target, he removed a small wooden brace he had prepared earlier, wedging it against the external door to the box, ensuring he would not be interrupted. Then, at precisely 10:15 p.m., as the play reached a moment designed for peak laughter, John Wilkes Booth silently slipped through the outer door of the presidential box, then the inner one, crossing the threshold of history with a Derringer pistol in hand. The interior of Ford's Theater on the evening of April 14, 1865, presented a tableau of seemingly ordinary, joyful respite. Gaslights cast a warm, inviting glow upon the velvet seats and gilded ornamentation, illuminating the faces of nearly 1,700 patrons. The air hummed with a low murmur of anticipation, punctuated by the rustle of programs and the occasional burst of appreciative laughter. A faint scent of gas, perfume, and damp wool permeated the atmosphere as the audience, comprising a cross-section of Washington, D.C. society, military officers, government officials, and civilians alike, lost themselves in the comedic narrative of Our American Cousin. It was a collective moment of release, a shared exhalation after years of unyielding national stress. In the presidential box, Box 7, situated prominently on the dress circle level, President Abraham Lincoln found a rare moment of genuine ease. He sat in a high-backed velvet rocking chair, positioned slightly forward, his lanky frame settling into the plush cushioning. His left hand rested gently over Mary Todd Lincoln's hand, a quiet, almost domestic gesture that spoke of shared comfort. Across from them, Major Henry Rathbone, a decorated Union Army officer, and his fiancée, Clara Harris, completed the presidential party. The quartet watched the unfolding farce on stage, their expressions mirroring the general amusement of the crowd. Lincoln, in particular, was observed to be unusually cheerful, his deep-set eyes crinkling at the corners with quiet laughter, a stark contrast to the profound melancholy that had long marked his public visage. For a fleeting hour, the crushing burdens of state, the profound grief of war, and the daunting task of reconstruction were set aside for the simple pleasure of a comedy. Unseen and unheard amidst the general merriment, a figure steeped in grim determination made his final, silent approach. John Wilkes Booth, having carefully observed through the peephole he had drilled, knew the precise rhythm of the play. He understood that the actor Harry Hawk, performing alone on stage in that particular scene, was minutes from delivering a line designed to elicit a predictable explosion of laughter from the audience. "Don't know the manners of good society, eh? Well, I guess I know enough to turn you inside out. Old gal, you sockdologizing old man trap." This specific phrase, known for its comedic punch, was Booth's carefully selected cue. It would provide the perfect acoustic cover, masking the sharp crack of his pistol shot. As Harry Hawk delivered the final exaggerated words, the theater erupted in a spontaneous, boisterous roar of laughter. It swelled, peaked, and reverberated through the space, momentarily overwhelming all other sounds. In that precisely chosen instant of maximal distraction, Booth silently pushed open the inner door of the presidential box. He stepped forward, his Derringer pistol already raised and steady. The small, deadly firearm was leveled approximately 6 inches from the back of President Lincoln's head, just behind his left ear. Without a second of hesitation, Booth pulled the trigger. The distinct sharp report of the .44 caliber pistol, though partially absorbed by the lingering peal of laughter, still cut through the air, a discordant alien sound that pierced the celebratory mood. The half-inch lead projectile tore into Lincoln's skull, traveled diagonally through his brain, and came to rest behind his right eye. The president slumped forward instantly, his head falling onto his chest. He was rendered immediately unconscious, his eyes closed, his breathing becoming shallow and ragged. Beside him, Mary Todd Lincoln's quiet joy shattered into an ear-splitting scream, a sound of unadulterated horror that instantly silenced the last echoes of the audience's laughter. Her cry, raw and primal, cleaved through the sudden disbelieving hush that descended upon the box. The swift, brutal transition from laughter to violence was incomprehensible, leaving those closest stunned and disoriented. Major Henry Rathbone, momentarily frozen in shock by the gunshot and Mary's shriek, was the first to comprehend the unfolding tragedy. He spun towards Booth, who remained standing within the box, the derringer's wisps of black powder smoke curling in the gaslight. Rathbone, an officer trained for combat, lunged forward with desperate resolve, attempting to seize the assassin. But Booth, his movements honed by years of stage combat and fueled by adrenaline, was prepared. He dropped the now useless pistol, his hand instinctively reaching for his formidable 7-inch Bowie knife. With a swift, savage motion, he plunged the blade deep into Rathbone's left arm, severing muscle and almost completely severing the brachial artery. Rathbone recoiled, clutching his profusely bleeding arm, his face contorted in pain and shock. Clara Harris, Rathbone's fiancée, screamed again, a high-pitched sound of terror that joined Mary Lincoln's cries, amplifying the growing sense of panic within the small space. Having incapacitated Rathbone, Booth did not pause. His act was not yet complete. With a deliberate theatrical flourish, he vaulted over the railing of the presidential box, aiming for a dramatic descent to the stage 12 feet below. However, in his haste and the inherent chaos of the moment, one of his riding spurs caught on the draped American flag adorning the box. This entanglement caused him to land awkwardly on the stage, his body twisting, and a sharp, excruciating pain shot through his left leg. He had fractured his fibula, just above the ankle. The impact was audible, a sickening crunch that briefly threatened to undermine his carefully orchestrated escape. Despite the searing pain, Booth, driven by an almost superhuman resolve and the adrenaline of his heinous act, managed to push himself back to his feet. He stood, though with a distinct pained limp, before an audience of 1,000 stunned individuals who now stared up at him in horrified silence. The shift from comedic entertainment to a scene of raw violence had rendered them utterly paralyzed. Raising his bloodied Bowie knife high above his head, its polished blade reflecting the stage lights with an ominous gleam, Booth delivered his final, defiant pronouncement. His voice, trained to project across large auditoriums, rang out with chilling clarity. Sic semper tyrannis, the Latin phrase meaning, "thus always to tyrants," the state motto of Virginia. Several witnesses also distinctly recalled him adding with a guttural roar, "The South is avenged." It was a moment of chilling, grotesque performance, the actor transforming his crime into a grand historical declaration, convinced of his role as a tragic hero. His declaration hanging heavy in the air, Booth did not linger to savor the stunned silence. He turned, his injured leg forcing an ungainly limp, and moved with surprising speed across the stage. He passed the now bewildered actor, Harry Hawk, who still stood frozen in place, a silent witness to the macabre drama that had usurped his play. Booth reached the stage's rear exit, a door he knew intimately from countless performances. He burst through it and disappeared into the narrow alleyway behind the theater. There, his bay horse, a swift chestnut, had been held ready by an accomplice. Booth scrambled onto the saddle, spurred the animal's flanks, and galloped frantically into the moonless Washington night. He crossed the Navy Yard Bridge into Maryland, leaving behind a theater plunged into pandemonium, a city on the precipice of unimaginable grief, and a nation irrevocably altered by his audacious, murderous act. The collective shock, the rising screams, and the dawning incredulity that filled Ford's theater marked the beginning of a profound national crisis, a wound that would fester for generations. The immediate aftermath of the shot within Ford's theater was a maelstrom of disorienting noise and terror. Mary Todd Lincoln's high-pitched scream, a sound of utter anguish, pierced the sudden, disbelieving silence that had fallen over the presidential box. Major Henry Rathbone, bleeding profusely from the deep stab wound in his arm, stumbled back, incapacitated. Clara Harris's cries joined Mrs. Lincoln's and the stunned audience below, still grappling with the transition from laughter to the sharp report of a gun, began to stir, confusion quickly giving way to collective panic. Shouts of, "He's shot the president!" and "Stop that man!" erupted, mingling with the escalating screams. Within moments, several individuals, including the young Army surgeon Dr. Charles Leal, an audience member seated closer to the stage, rushed to the presidential box. Leal, just 23 years old but possessing sharp medical instincts, was the first physician to reach the fallen president. Lincoln, slumped forward in his chair, was unresponsive, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Leal quickly discovered the small, dark entry wound behind Lincoln's left ear. After a rapid, grim assessment, understanding the severity of such a head injury in the medical context of 1865, Dr. Leal issued an immediate and definitive diagnosis. The wound was mortal. There was no hope of recovery. The decision was made to move the president from the chaotic theater. It was determined that the perilous journey by carriage back to the White House would be too dangerous and potentially fatal. Instead, Lincoln was carefully carried across 10th Street to the Peterson House, a modest brick boarding house directly opposite Ford's Theater. He was laid diagonally on a small, simple bed in a rear bedroom on the first floor, a bed far too short for his 6'4" frame. His long legs dangled off the side. The room, humble and stark, became the somber stage for the nation's vigil. For the next 9 agonizing hours, the small bedroom was a place of hushed despair and frantic medical efforts. Dr. Leal, joined by other physicians, worked tirelessly but fruitlessly, probing the wound, attempting to clear the blood clot, and making Lincoln as comfortable as possible. Mary Todd Lincoln, inconsolable with grief, was at times beside herself. Her agonizing wails and pleas often necessitated her temporary removal from the room, only for her to return, drawn by an irresistible pull to her dying husband. Outside the room, a succession of dignitaries gathered, their faces grim, their presence a testament to the magnitude of the tragedy unfolding. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, taking immediate command of the situation, coordinated the nascent hunt for the conspirators while simultaneously managing the crisis of leadership. Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles, whose detailed diary would later provide invaluable insights, was present, his face a mask of sorrow. Senator Charles Sumner, the radical Republican abolitionist, sat by Lincoln's bedside for a time, holding the president's hand in a silent display of affection and solidarity. Other cabinet members and military generals arrived throughout the night, huddled in the cramped parlor or stood vigil outside the bedroom door, their hushed conversations punctuated only by the president's increasingly labored breathing. As the night wore on, Lincoln's vital signs progressively weakened. His breathing became shallower, more sporadic, a harrowing struggle for life. The physicians could do nothing but witness the inevitable. The room was illuminated by a solitary gas lamp, casting long, flickering shadows on the stoic faces of the men surrounding the bed. Just as dawn broke on April 15, 1865, at precisely 7:22 a.m., Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, drew his last breath. A profound stillness descended upon the room. It was Edwin Stanton, eyes brimming with emotion, who reportedly broke the silence with words that would echo through history. Now he belongs to the ages. The nation, which had celebrated victory just days before, was plunged into an unprecedented depth of shock and grief, its leader a martyr. In stark contrast to the somber vigil at Peterson House, John Wilkes Booth was engaged in a desperate, agonizing flight for survival. After his dramatic escape from Ford's Theater, he spurred his swift bay horse, known for its speed, down the dark alley and into the Washington night. The excruciating pain from his fractured left leg, sustained during his leap from the presidential box, became his constant, tormenting companion. He rode furiously, crossing the Navy Yard Bridge into southern Maryland, a region known for its Confederate sympathies. There, he rendezvoused with David Harold, the young pharmacist's assistant who had fled Washington after failing to guide Lewis Powell to Secretary Seward's residence, Powell having arrived alone. Harold, intimately familiar with the backroads and swamps of Maryland, became Booth's guide and accomplice, a crucial asset in the unfolding manhunt. The pair navigated through the rural, heavily wooded terrain, their progress hampered by Booth's debilitating injury and the need for secrecy. In the pre-dawn hours, the pain from Booth's leg became unbearable, forcing them to seek medical aid. They arrived at the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd, a local physician known to Booth. Mudd, supposedly unaware of the identity of his wounded patient, set Booth's fractured fibula and provided temporary shelter, offering a vital respite in the early hours of the escape. This act would later become a focal point of controversy and legal scrutiny. From Dr. Mudd's farm, Booth and Harold continued their harrowing journey, often hiding in the dense, mosquito-infested swamps and thick forests of southern Maryland, moving stealthily under the cloak of night. Thousands of federal soldiers, detectives, and bounty hunters were already fanning out across the region, turning the pursuit into one of the largest manhunts in American history. Booth's physical suffering was immense, each movement of his horse sending jolts of agony through his shattered leg, but his mental state remained one of fierce defiance rather than remorse. During this period of desperate flight, Booth maintained a diary, a chilling testament to his unyielding conviction. Far from expressing regret or acknowledging the enormity of his crime, his entries seethed with indignation that he was being pursued as a common criminal. He believed himself to be a persecuted hero, a liberator, comparing himself explicitly to ancient tyrannicides like Brutus, who slew Caesar, and the legendary Swiss folk hero William Tell. "I do not regret the deed," he scrawled, his words reflecting a profound self-delusion. "I can prove that I have done more for my country than any other man." He meticulously justified his actions, casting Lincoln as a tyrannical figure who had systematically dismantled the Constitution. In Booth's twisted narrative, Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus, his jailing of political opponents without trial, and his prosecution of a war of invasion against sovereign states were all egregious abuses of power. Above all, Booth condemned Lincoln for emancipating 4 million enslaved people, which he considered the greatest atrocity of all, a radical social revolution that threatened to destroy the white civilization he held sacred. He remained utterly convinced of his righteousness, unable to comprehend why the entire North, and even significant portions of the South, viewed him as a monster rather than the patriot he believed himself to be. His paranoia grew with each passing hour, but it was overshadowed by an unwavering, delusional certainty in the nobility of his cause, even as the walls closed in around him. The desperate flight of John Wilkes Booth, a harrowing 12-day ordeal of excruciating pain and mounting paranoia, concluded on April 26, 1865. Thousands of federal troops, detectives, and bounty hunters, driven by the enormity of President Lincoln's assassination, had relentlessly pursued Booth across southern Maryland and into Virginia. Their relentless search led them to Richard Garrett's tobacco farm near Port Royal, Virginia, where Booth and David Harold, his sole remaining accomplice, were found hiding in a barn. Shortly after midnight, a detachment of the 16th New York Cavalry Regiment, under Lieutenant Edward P. Doherty, surrounded the farm. After verifying the fugitives' presence, soldiers demanded their surrender. David Harold, overcome by fear, quickly complied, emerging from the barn to be disarmed and secured. Booth, however, remained inside, defiant despite his fractured leg and the overwhelming odds. Refusing to surrender, he challenged the soldiers. Unwilling to risk a direct assault, the cavalry commander ordered the barn set ablaze. Flames rapidly engulfed the dry timber, illuminating the structure and filling it with dense smoke. Booth, trapped and in agony, moved within the inferno, knife in hand, preparing for a final stand. Through a gap in the barn's planks, Sergeant Boston Corbett, a religiously fervent soldier, saw Booth's silhouette. Disregarding specific orders to capture Booth alive, Corbett fired his pistol. The single shot struck Booth in the neck, almost precisely in the same location where Booth's bullet had entered Lincoln's skull. The impact severed Booth's spinal cord, causing instant paralysis from the neck down. Soldiers quickly pulled Booth from the burning barn and laid him on the porch of the farmhouse. For 3 agonizing hours he lay conscious but immobile, his eyes fixed on his useless hands. His reported last words, "Useless, useless," echoed his bitter frustration at his incapacitation. As dawn broke on April 26th, John Wilkes Booth died. His body was transported to Washington and secretly buried beneath a warehouse floor to prevent his grave from becoming a Confederate shrine. Years later, his remains were eventually released to his family and interred in an unmarked grave at Green Mount Cemetery in Baltimore. With Booth's death, the nation's focus shifted to the surviving conspirators. Driven by profound grief and a demand for swift justice, the government began the trial of 8 individuals: Mary Surratt, Lewis Powell, George Atzerodt, David Harold, Dr. Samuel Mudd, Michael O'Laughlin, Samuel Arnold, and Edmund Spangler. The proceedings were conducted by a military commission, a decision made under wartime emergency powers, overriding objections that civilians should be tried in civil courts. The atmosphere was one of intense public vengeance. The prosecution presented a case detailing a broad conspiracy to destabilize the government. Lewis Powell was condemned for his brutal attack on Secretary of State William Seward. George Atzerodt was found guilty despite his failure to assassinate Vice President Andrew Johnson. David Harold's role as Booth's accomplice was undeniable. Mary Surratt, accused of aiding and abetting the plot through her boarding house meetings, became the first woman executed by the federal government. Dr. Samuel Mudd was convicted for assisting Booth, claiming ignorance of his identity. Michael O'Laughlin and Samuel Arnold were implicated in earlier kidnapping plots, and Edmund Spangler, a stage carpenter, for facilitating Booth's escape. John Surratt Jr., Mary's son and a key conspirator, had fled to Europe, avoiding immediate capture. In July 1865, the commission delivered its verdicts. 4 conspirators, Mary Surratt, Lewis Powell, George Atzerodt, and David Harold, were sentenced to death by hanging. Samuel Mudd, Michael O'Laughlin, and Samuel Arnold received life sentences, while Edmund Spangler was given 6 years. On July 7th, amid the brutal summer heat, the 4 condemned were publicly executed at the Washington Arsenal, a stark symbol of the nation's resolve to punish those responsible for the assassination. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln had profound and lasting consequences, irrevocably altering the course of American history. His death removed the only figure with the moral authority and political acumen to navigate the complex challenges of Reconstruction, particularly balancing civil rights for newly freed African Americans with reconciliation for the white South. His successor, Andrew Johnson, a Southern Unionist, proved to be deeply prejudiced and clashed with the radical Republicans in Congress over their civil rights policies. Reconstruction subsequently descended into turmoil, marked by legislative reforms, violent Southern resistance through organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, and ultimately, political compromises that abandoned African Americans to decades of segregation and disenfranchisement under Jim Crow laws. While whether Lincoln could have succeeded where Johnson failed remains a historical debate, his absence undeniably left a void in national leadership during a critical period. The tragedy also cemented Lincoln's legacy as a martyr for the Union and emancipation. His assassination on Good Friday, a day of deep Christian significance, immediately drew parallels in the public mind to the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Sermons across the North depicted Lincoln as a national redeemer who died for the Union and freedom. His body was transported on a solemn funeral train that traversed 654 miles through 7 states over 13 days, echoing his inaugural journey. Hundreds of thousands lined the tracks, and an estimated 7 million Americans viewed his coffin or the funeral cortege, a national ritual of mourning that helped the war-weary nation process its loss and find meaning in his sacrifice. For the ideological remnants of the Confederacy, John Wilkes Booth's legacy remained complex. Publicly, many Southern leaders condemned the assassination, fearing it would only worsen the South's fate. Privately, and later in lost cause narratives, some revered Booth as a martyred patriot, the last defender of a vanishing civilization. This view, however, required a complete revision of history, transforming the Civil War into a noble fight for states' rights, romanticizing plantation life while ignoring slavery's brutality, and reframing secession as heroic resistance to tyranny. Booth died immersed in this distorted mythology, genuinely believing he was emulating the Founding Fathers. This delusional certainty, the conviction of an intelligent, talented man that murdering a democratically elected president was an act of patriotism, serves as a perennial warning about the profound dangers of ideological extremism and the failure to question one's own cultural and moral premises. Booth died considering himself an unsung hero. History, in its clearer judgment, rightly remembers him as an assassin whose bullet did not save anything, but merely prolonged the agony of a nation striving to be reborn from the ashes of its bloodiest conflict. The echoes of a single gunshot in Ford's Theater reverberated far beyond the walls of that fateful playhouse, shaping a nation's destiny. John Wilkes Booth's desperate 12-day flight culminated in a burning barn, his defiance silenced by a single bullet, his last words, "Useless, useless," a desolate testament to a shattered delusion. The swift, vengeful justice that followed saw his co-conspirators meet grim fates, some at the gallows, others in prisons, as a grief-stricken nation sought retribution. But the true, enduring consequence lay in the vacuum left by Abraham Lincoln's death. The president, martyred for the Union and emancipation, was removed from the delicate precipice of Reconstruction, ushering in an era of profound political turbulence, racial division, and the slow, painful genesis of Jim Crow. Booth's self-appointed heroism, born from a crucible of distorted ideology, stands as a chilling testament to the power of conviction when untethered from empathy and objective truth. His desperate act, fueled by a narrative that romanticized oppression and demonized progress, failed to save the South as he envisioned. Instead, it exacerbated its suffering and deepened its wounds. The history of that fateful April night is not merely a tale of assassination, but a stark, enduring warning. How the fervent belief in a perceived tyranny can blind individuals to the true nature of their actions, transforming patriotism into depravity and leaving behind a legacy of sorrow that resonates across generations. How does an individual's unwavering conviction transform into an act that history unequivocally condemns? And what profound lessons can we, as a society, draw from the collision of personal ideology and national fate? Share your reflections in the comments below. If the shadows of history and the complexities of human motivation intrigue you, we invite you to explore more untold narratives. Consider our deep dive into the mysteries surrounding General Sherman's March to the Sea, available on our channel. Don't forget to like this video, share your thoughts below, and subscribe to Hidden Files for more journeys into the untold narratives of our past.